This session is Accelerating Health, Our Leadership Role. And just the theme is, it should be in every company's DNA to address the cancer burden. We've already heard so many of that call to action already. This session is to help construct the corporate responsibility and community role for advancing improved health outcomes for all, beginning with an oncology focus. Our moderator today is Jude Ngang, with PharmD, MBA, Executive Director, Representation in Clinical Research of Amgen. Our panel is Ghiorghiu, Dr. Serban, Vice President, Head of Clinical Late Development Oncology, and Head of R&D, Patient and Clinical Sciences, AstraZeneca. Dr. Edith Mitchell, President's Cancer Panel member. Jean K. Pierre, Esquire, and Chancellor, Southern University Law Center. And Chris Sarchi, General Manager and Head of Oncology, Sanofi. Jude, the panel and the floor are yours.
Thank you, Mary-Lise. Good morning, everyone. What a privilege here to continue today's discussion with a panel of renowned experts who are leaders in their respective fields, both nationally and globally. I think we've really heard from very inspiring journey from Marty, who took us the history, and then also Dr. Williams really gave us some great call to action that personally I actually took some as well to take back. But then Dr. Peters also gave us some real good what happens at the front line. This is really energizing as we continue the discussion now with this panel of experts who are also leaders in the field. I will start first by taking us just a few journey back, because the disease of cancer, the acute mortality of it could be discouraging. But going forward, we need resilience to stay the fight and to actually continue to be bold, as Marty really reminded us this morning. So looking back a few years, we've seen how there's been increase there's been reduction in mortality. Dr. Williams mentioned the plateau in screening, but would have some reduction in mortality in the low single digits. But when it comes to mortality, we need a lot more. And with accelerating the health going forward, the panel here will share now what they do in their respective fields to sort of accelerate, but also give us some additional call to actions. So today's discussion, I will start by calling the panelists and asking them a few questions. But most importantly, we also want to allow time at the end for the audience to ask questions. So with that, if I may start with Chris. We did hear again how the National Cancer Report did show the reduction in mortality, as I mentioned. However, the pandemic had an impact. Can you take us through what that impact is and maybe what we need to do to get back on that track to continue to reduce mortality?
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity. So, when you think about the impact of the pandemic over the last couple of years, you have to begin by realizing that every patient in every oncology office around the country is immunocompromised and at greater risk for complications if they were to contract COVID-19. And so the world changed very quickly in early 2020. And so what we saw was a retraction in routine screening. And Dr. Williams talked about that today and how important that is, right? For the safety of patients, preventing them from coming into the office and being exposed, they stayed back. Shortly after that, we started talking about what could be the long-term repercussions of this delay in screening, right? We were seeing delays when it came to breast cancer, colon cancer, skin cancer, lung cancer, and we know that the impacts will be felt for the next 5 to 10 years or more, with delayed diagnosis, poorer prognosis, and worsening patient outcomes. And so, those things are all very, very real. But what's interesting and maybe not surprising is, at the same time, we're also seeing a reduction in select areas of the country with patient treatments with some of the most important tumor types there are in breast cancer, in lung cancer, colon, and multiple myeloma. And so that's an ongoing challenge that we have to be up against, right? I think if you think about other impacts of the pandemic, At the height of the pandemic, we had a loss of jobs, right? A high unemployment rate, a loss of insurance. Patients needed help to access their medications, which was an important challenge. We had a slowing in some segments, not at MD Anderson, but in some segments, a slowing of patient accruals to clinical trials, right? Potentially delaying the impact of bringing new innovative medicines to patients who are counting on them. And then if you think about something Dr. Heath said yesterday, this has been an incredibly dynamic period. It still is today with regards to healthcare coverage, right? Shortage of support staff, of workers in the clinics and hospitals. And so that's created this really uncertain environment. And as the new generation steps in, one of the ways they've always looked to stay up to date with the daily changes that are happening in the world of oncology is through the relationships with industries. What we're seeing right now is a pretty dramatic repression of access, right? Based upon the chaos that's existing in the practices. And again, every patient in every office is immunocompromised, so many offices have closed access to folks outside of the patient population. So what this does is it forces us to look for new and innovative ways to provide insights and gain insights into some of the latest breaking news when it comes to oncology. Again, we're still looking for the best ways to do that, but that's been an ongoing challenge. When it comes to helping patients overcome some of the access challenges, right, many in the industry have had to go back and revamp their patient assistance programs, not just make it more robust, but make it easier for patients to access, right? Patients aren't going to be able to come into the office as they used to. So how do you create an environment that's simple and easy for them to get a hold of and help provide the benefits that they're looking for? So another really key important element for the private practice setting, they're also under a lot of pressure right now. And so many of the manufacturers had to go back and re-examine how are we going to distribute our medicines, right? There's been changes in payment terms, helping to ease the burden of the practices as they're dealing with the chaos that's occurring locally. And that's been an ongoing challenge that I think is getting better. And then beyond that, when we talk about some of the challenges with regards to enrolling clinical trials, and I think we'll spend more time talking about that later this morning, but for us, it's about exploring every opportunity we can to ensure that underrepresented patients are enrolled in clinical trials. And one of the ways we're doing that is by looking to decentralize centralized clinical trials, right? Understanding the social determinants that are impacting patients' ability to drive 2 or 3 hours to take part in a clinical trial. Instead, bring it to their homes so they can help take part in these clinical trials. And I think the examples from Dr. Pfister today on how they're doing that in more of an electronic, virtual way is also going to help us overcome those barriers. So there's a lot going on. I think Marty said it this morning. We've been asked to be bold and take some risks and make some big advancements. I think for us and as an industry, we're still catching up, right? The chaos of the pandemic has forced us to respond. We're at that pivotal point now where we need to move from a period of response to how do we become more bold and bring greater value to patients and providers.
Thank you, Chris. Looking forward maybe to next report coming out in 2023 to see if there's improvement there. So I think maybe I can take it. The next question will be for Dr. Mitchell. And we are, I think, 2 decades from the completion of the Human Genome Project. There have been multiple genome-wide associated studies. And there have been, of course, a lot of advancements in the cancer field, the field of oncology, when it comes to genomics. Could you take us through or discuss what are the advancements in genomics and what opportunities lie within genomics to actually further accelerate health when it comes to cancer?
Oh, certainly. And thank you for asking me to speak about a topic that is very dear to my heart. And when we think about genomics and genetics related to cancer, think about it was just a few decades ago that there was the elucidation of the estrogen receptor for treating breast cancer and where we are today. There was also in my city, the Philadelphia chromosome and other genomic entities that have been entered into the arena from research. But the important thing is for patients, what does this all mean? And for patients, it means that some of these receptors and genomic profiles are used for risk assessment for the patient. For example, in breast cancer, triple-negative breast cancer having a much higher mortality rate and difficulty in terms of therapeutic interventions. Others, and I will speak about a few more. Obviously, we don't want to stay here all day because there is so much information. So, for example, lung cancer. Lung cancer is the greatest killer of cancer patients in the United States. And what we have now, as opposed to what we did years ago, for non-small cell lung cancer, there was chemotherapy, and all the patients got the same chemotherapy. Now, with genomic profiling, prior to the first treatment, we can elect to use EGFR therapeutics or others. And we are learning more about non-small cell lung cancer with the number of clinical trials ongoing. For example, there is the lung care match from the National Cancer Institute, and many of our pharma companies are working with us in a collaborative manner to find other therapeutic interventions related to the genomic profiles and processes. So we have a lot ongoing in terms of the newer therapies and what we're thinking about. One of the areas of research following lung map and others to define just lung cancer treatments, we have the NCI match. And I am very privileged to be one of the co-investigators for NCI match. Now, this is a genomic profile where patients' tumors are evaluated for the genomic alterations, and then therapeutic interventions assigned based on those genomic alterations identified. So it is without a tumor-specific entity for diagnosis, so that whatever the genomic alteration is, whether it's an ovarian cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, whatever, that therapy is assigned. And we're evaluating those. There were 39 different arms of the match study, and we are getting close to the end now and collecting data. But the idea is, do we need to be tumor-specific or genomic alteration specific? So that that's one of the areas of research now. And in my opinion, we should evaluate the patient's tumor's genomic alterations before initiating therapy, so that one can plan for multiple therapies later if that is needed. But in some patients, based on the genomic profile, we are finding complete remissions in the first treatment for the patient. So, for example, for lung cancer, we want to make sure that we use the available treatment entities, and that can only be done at the initial evaluation of the tumor. What many people do or have done in the past is wait until after the patient has progressed through the earlier interventions and then adding the genomic profile. And I think it's so important for us to know on most patients at the initial evaluation. So early evaluation of the genomic processes in the tumor. The other is circulating tumor markers. We are now able to use circulating DNA or RNA, and more research is ongoing for even different management profiles for tumor cells or the deposits from those cells as they're dying. in the blood so that we can have a continuous process of evaluation. So you'll hear circulating DNA or circulating tumor markers. That's another area of research. So much evaluation, therapeutic benefit to the patient. So we've got to look at what does this benefit, or how does it benefit the patient, and how does it allow the care team, both the research care team and the clinical care team, to facilitate efforts toward patients. And with this, we are seeing much more benefit for our patients, much more research to be done, and we need to include patients in clinical trials. Many times people say the patient didn't participate, the patient didn't want a clinical trial, but with patient-reported data, where patients are asked, why didn't you participate in a clinical trial? The patient said 80% of patients who didn't participate said they were never asked. So we've got to put the onus on ourselves, make sure that we know what we can offer patients, make sure that we have continuity in the offerings, because many clinical trials now, especially in oncology as well as other disease processes, are based on the genomic profile, and we need more research. So let's make sure that we pass those biases that eliminate certain patients from clinical trials, offering all patients clinical trials that can be very important, not only for that patient, but for expanding the research continuum. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. I think on the question of clinical trials, we will come back to it again as well,
sure,
so the other panelists could have a chance to weigh in. My next question actually is also related to you. Thanks to the great work that you do with your colleagues at the President's Cancer Panel. Your colleague took us this morning through the report, but specifically, if you could take us back to that report and discuss the gaps where it's related to screening and diagnostics. And then the second part of the question, maybe we could open to Serban to really talk about how supporting early diagnostics could help accelerate health. So Dr. Mitchell, again to you, can you talk about the gaps in the President's Cancer Panel report?
Certainly, and I was very honored to be a part of that panel and developing the report. And the gaps in cancer screening were there prior to the pandemic. We had not reached optimum screening for cancers. If you will recall, years ago there was the American Cancer Society's 80 by 18, so it was to reach 80% colorectal cancer screening by 2018. We didn't get there. And with the President's Cancer Panel and all of the advocates and the researchers, the clinicians, those from the NCI and others, there was a team of 160 individuals putting together this. So we looked at 4 cancers. We can't do everything at one time. There was breast, cervix, colorectal, and lung cancer screening. And what was found was that cervical cancer screening was higher, but there was less intensification of the process utilizing HPV and other modalities. So the vaccine for HPV, the diagnostic for HPV had not been maximally utilized, although cervical cancer screening was the top screening modality. Next was colorectal cancer, and breast cancer, sorry. Breast cancer followed cervical, and then colorectal. And we never reached maximum benefit and maximum utilization of either breast cancer screening as well as colorectal screening. And while many people feared colonoscopy, we also had stool-based testing that, again, not maximally utilized. And the one that I was most surprised by was lung cancer screening. I gave a lecture on this topic, about 500 people in the audience, and I just asked how many people know that you can screen for lung cancer. There were only about 5 hands, and these were clinicians. So education on lung cancer screening and why many physicians and other clinicians did not know. So when we look at these 4 cancers, what we need to do, in my opinion, is group them together so that whenever an individual is evaluated, for example, screening for breast cancer, mammogram ordered, look at other cancers that that patient might be at risk for and encourage evaluation. While we know lung cancer or cervical cancer screening is high, what we don't realize is what continuation is needed. And for women over age 60 who think that they no longer need to see their GYN clinician, what we see now, and it has been released in certain avenues, that uterine cancer is increasing in women in the United States. The greatest group at risk, the group over 60 years old, that group that is no longer seeing their GYN clinicians. So if there's anything that you take away from this is women over age 60 or who've gone through the menopause should continue some evaluations with their GYN doctors. And as the National Cancer Institute does more with the research, more will be coming out of the research avenues. So we need to continue that. And we really need to amp up lung cancer screening. So, and that includes not only the clinicians, but the insurance companies too. I recently had a patient that I treated for breast cancer, and after everything was finished, it's all good. I said, now, you stopped smoking the day you got the diagnosis for breast cancer. Yes. And we went through it, and I said, now I want to order the low-dose CT scan for evaluation for lung cancer. My staff reported back to me, if you want this scan, you've got to do a peer-to-peer. Now, a peer-to-peer for practicing clinicians, that's a 4-letter word, right? And when I talked with the person at the insurance company, the doctor said to me, now I'm going to teach you something about breast cancer surveillance. And I thought, going to teach me something? Okay, I'll go along with it. And the doctor at the insurance company says, well, CT scans are no longer a part of breast cancer surveillance. And I said, okay, what's the teaching part? And he was denying that test for the patient. I said, did you read my note? We sent it. Did you read my order? Well, yes. I said, what I ordered, and it's in my note, the patient's history of smoking and the USPSTF guidelines, so it should be covered. And he says, oh, I didn't know it was for lung cancer. I said, well, that's what my note says, so now who's teaching who? But we really need to look at patients in a whole manner so that you are requesting the consultations needed, the process, so that patients can be screened for their appropriate screening test. And therefore, as I said, less than 10% of individuals in this country eligible for lung cancer screening are appropriately managed. So we really need to increase all of our screening, make sure our patients are getting through those screens, and then the appropriate follow-up for therapeutic and diagnostic tests once that is identified. So in summary, the gaps in screening occur over multiple levels, and for the 4 tumors that we evaluated for screening gaps as a part of the President's Cancer Panel, we need to really use what we have available to us, both for patient education, for community assessments, and for our plans for the patients, and going to their communities. We usually say outreach, what is your outreach? But your outreach should be your community reach. And we have vans now, mobile units, going to communities where the people are, and not just outreach to come into the main center. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. I think on that same theme, we're not done with the screening and diagnostic. That's where the journey begins. And maybe, Serban, if I can come on to you now to continue, what is the value or the impact of really understanding the screening and diagnosis early to help reduce the disparities gap, the disparities in health outcomes that we experience for cancer?
Definitely. And firstly, it's humbling to follow after Dr. Mitchell. So I will do my best. And I think I was particularly happy when I've been asked to be a panelist in this session, speaking about our joint leadership role on eliminating cancer as a cause of death. Because obviously, speaking as someone coming from the pharmaceutical industry, they expect, hey, it's a lot about science. I'm coming here in front of all of you to say it's a lot about equity. It's science and equity. And in order to make a true impact and to reach that bold vision, that also Dr. Williams had mentioned before, we need both to implement the science, but also to implement the equity. And then we need to look through the entire healthcare continuum in each and every step to see how we build equity. Because we need to bring screening to one and every patient. Because there's so much innovation happening, we need to make sure that all that innovation and all that support is reaching one and every patient. And I think the biggest impact will be on screening, will be in reaching all the underserved populations. And I'm happy to share a couple of initiatives that we have triggered at AstraZeneca. It's like, firstly, we have partnered with ACCC, and we launched the Rural Appalachian Lung Cancer Screening Program, fully focused on communities, trying to understand what are the drivers, trying to see how we can improve screening by at least 30%, and then digesting those learnings, and with the collaboration with ACCC, to extend those principles on how to bring underserved patients into screening across all 2,100 community centers from ACCC. Another initiative, again, trying to bring equity and to bring screening, either directly or indirectly. Outside of US, we have partnered with an AI company, with CureAI, to look at and to analyze the X-rays. And I know there will be many experts here who will say, Serban, can I teach you something? X-ray is not so perfect. I know. But let's not forget there will be a lot of X-ray, and if we use AI, we will be able, in a significant number of instances, to detect cancer, lung cancer, that otherwise will not be detected. And for many of the middle-income regions, that will be particularly relevant and will be a complementary approach to screening. So I think this is where I'm coming and sharing how, through our joint leadership, we should focus on all aspects of the healthcare continuum to make that impact and to move the needle.
Thank you, Serban. That's really bold. So I think maybe we could shift back. The theme of disparities and equity, which you did mention, is really important, especially after the pandemic started. So I would move on now to the disparities in health outcomes. So maybe I'll start, my first question will be to you, Jean-Pierre, to invite you as well. There has been the evolution of innovative therapies to treat cancer. And in that, despite this evolution, there's still been not an equitable or equal reduction in mortalities when it comes to the racial and ethnic groups. So, and then also the second part of this is also continuous underrepresentation of some groups or underrepresented groups in clinical trials. So I will start first with you, Jean-Pierre. What are the efforts maybe that need to be done to address the disparities we see in health outcomes?
Well, thank you very much. So one of the things, and some people would say, well, what is a law school? Why is a law school being involved in this conversation? And, I get those looks. I say, well, there are a lot of things. So let me explain to you what I think we can do. First of all, a lot of the disparities occur because there's a lack of information. People need information. If they get information from a trusted source, they tend to want to become engaged. So what we found in terms of what we're doing at Southern University Law Center is we found that we had a lot of students that were interested in health law and policy issues. And then we started noticing, well, we were having students that were coming in from nursing, various medical doctors coming to law school, so forth and so on, because they wanted to be advocates. And they wanted to figure out a way to be advocates, not necessarily to be litigators, but to be advocates, to be policy leaders. So we started developing sort of this ecosystem. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a very successful wellness and cancer information session at the Law Center where we collaborated with healthcare organizations, with insurance companies, et cetera, to talk about the issues, especially in minority-serving communities, because as an HBCU law school, most HBCUs are in the middle of minority communities. So HBCUs as a ecosystem partner in this whole fight can be trusted sources to provide this information to people that are most affected by the disparities in terms of the outcomes. And then we have to talk about advocacy, to figure out ways to advocate for more involvement, to reduce some of the bureaucratic burden processes that make it difficult for people of color to participate in clinical trials, to remove fear. Because, as I said kind of yesterday, there's the Henrietta Lacks story that people remember, and there has to be a discussion of how we deal with that particular thing. One idea, as I was listening to, how can we help deal with the funding issues that's associated? There are a lot of corporations that benefited from what was learned from Henrietta Lacks. And perhaps we should charge those corporations with a social justice initiative to help reduce the disparities with respect to cancer outcomes, and say you have a role in this and you have a responsibility to help fund some of these initiatives. Because I hear some great initiatives, and there are always the issues about resources. So there are ways that we can play a significant role. We actually are working with, for example, our Ag Center to talk about figuring out how to help people understand healthy food choices. We actually got a grant a few years ago for a distance learning and telemedicine grant. And they said, what's the law school doing with a distance learning and telemedicine grant? Well, in many rural communities, they don't have access to information. So by doing that, now we can, especially during the period of pandemic, can discuss and bring information to rural communities, which, if we started talking about access to health care in rural communities, that's a whole nother tragedy that we have yet to deal with in this country. So we believe that these are strategies that can be helpful, and we're bringing a different voice to this conversation.
Well, thank you for that courage. I think we have time maybe for one more question to the panelists and make sure we open up for the audience for questions. So maybe, Chris, if I may go back to you on the clinical trials piece, if you can add more to it, and if we have maybe a few more minutes, maybe Serban can conclude on that. What can we do as leaders in industry to help improve the participation of underrepresented populations in clinical trials?
Great. So thanks. You know, one of the things I'm most passionate about, in addition to my day-to-day job, is the role I play as lead for Sanofi's Equity and Inclusion and Diversity Council for North America. And the question that came up yesterday was, what's changed in the last 40 years, which is a question we asked ourselves. And I think if you look at the room here today, this wouldn't have happened 40 years ago. I can't pretend to know, despite the gray in my beard. I wasn't here 40 years ago to be able to do that. But in the last 30 years, you know, I know we've seen a greater level of awareness. We've seen greater level of accountability. And one of the things we've done recently is established a dashboard internally, right? So any given day, we can tell you exactly what the level of diversity is in any patient enrolled in a clinical trial across the country with our products. That might seem like Atari in an Xbox world, but it's a big step forward, because with that data, we can start to elevate levels of accountability. Beyond that, what we've done is we've leveraged our partnerships with patient advocacy organizations and patients in general, right? Understanding what their needs are from a clinical trial perspective, having them help us shape our early stage clinical trials with a lens of diversity on top of that, right? Which is really important. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, moving from a centralized to a decentralized clinical trial approach to help ensure that some of those social determinants that serve as barriers to access to clinical trials are minimized. And then one of the things that I think is really, really cool, and it underscores the importance of collaborations like this, is an initiative that we just announced recently where we joined Merck and Novartis in the Beacon of Hope initiative, right? This is a really cool initiative that's designed to help us get to the root cause of why we see diversity challenges with clinical trial enrollments. Out of that, we are partnering with 26 historically black colleges and universities, 4 HBUC medical centers. We're working with the National Medical Association, the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, and Concerta to help ensure that we together find a better solution to some of the problems we're facing today with regards to clinical trial enrollment in underrepresented populations.
Great, thank you. I think I would have to wrap up now. We are at time, but it's really been an encouraging conversation. Thank you for the courage, the boldness, and I took some points there. One thing I'll conclude with is really encouraged to hear the collaboration, especially that you mentioned at the end, Chris, the cross-industry collaboration, which takes me back to what Marty began here, where the industry comes together. Thank you for your time, and please. 2 questions. Thank you. We have time for 2 questions.
Who will be the fastest ones?
So I can...
Good. So without a question, then maybe Dr. Mitchell, if I may come back to you, we can go to the Cancer Moonshot program. I think the President reignited that program this year. Can you discuss maybe and share with the audience what are the successes or achievements, and most importantly, what it holds for the future?
Oh, absolutely. And the Cancer Moonshot, of course, established in 2016. And it is about, that part of it is about to finish now. On February 2nd, 2022, President Biden announced that he was reigniting the Cancer Moonshot. Whereas the previous Cancer Moonshot focused on laboratory research and clinical research, this reignition is going to involve communities, patients, non-patients, in other words, prevention. And he indicated that he wanted everybody in the United States to participate. And therefore, his goal was a 50% decrease in cancer mortality rates over 25 years. So you'll hear more about that as these programs are established in 2023. And I was given that I could talk about this, but I also want to re-emphasize the screening. And I mentioned earlier that cervical cancer screening has the top level of screening in this country. But with appropriate screening and utilization of our HPV opportunities, we can really eliminate the mortality of cervical cancer in this country. And I would like to recognize one person in the audience who many of you may not know or may not know his involvement with the HPV and his delineation of all of the work that he has done at the National Cancer Institute, including being the interim director of NCI 3 times when directors left for whatever reason. But I think it's up to us in our community and all of us here to recognize people for what they do. So Dr. Doug Lowy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Michel. So I think with that, I think thanks for the call to action and for re-emphasizing the potential to reduce the mortality for cervical cancer. The panel has really taken us through a theme here. How do we reduce the disparities in health outcomes? I hope, and I'm also taking a commitment as I go back as well, to continue the work we do at Amgen as leaders in this space, to also come back next year, hopefully, with an improvement beyond the single-digit improvement that we're currently seeing. Please join me in giving a hand of applause to the audience.